You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
Time's on my mind when I had you by my side. Am I thinking loud? Do I want you around? Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning, death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. Now, I was going to tell you this program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. It is streaming live, they tell me, on 3cr.org.au, but the program is pre-recorded, so I won't be talking about current events because I'm not here, but I will be talking about the forthcoming federal election and why we should bother. Why bother? Why bother being involved in parliamentary politics? Because a lot of anarchists find it offensive to be involved in parliamentary politics. I can understand why. Now, if you wonder what anarchism is all about, an anarchist society is a voluntary, non-hierarchical society based on the creation of political and social structures which are based on equal decision-making power and equal access to society's wealth. Why this definition? Well, the word anarchos means without rulers. That's right. It means without rulers. Not without rules, but without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? Inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve, that's share power, and the struggle to hold wealth in common. So, let's talk about the forthcoming federal election. Now, I don't know if the federal election has been called or not, because as I said, this is a pre-record. But whether it's been called or not, we have the same ideas about it. So what is parliamentary politics? Parliamentary politics is a little bit like an amoeba. It's a rotatory type of democracy where the majority rules, right? In a parliamentary democracy, and Australia likes to think itself as a parliamentary democracy, you elect a representative from a reasonably equal electorate. Most electorates in a federal election have over 100,000 voters. And you elect these representatives to Parliament. Simple enough. But the problem is that most of the representatives we elect belong to a political party. Whether it's the ALP, the United Australia Party, the Greens, the Nationals, the Liberals, Animal Justice Party, Marijuana Party, you name it. There's lots of parties. Obviously there's only 2 or 3 that really matter in terms of electoral success, but it's a party-based system. So the party determines who, in the majority of cases, who the candidate's going to be. And those candidates subscribe to a particular ideology, the party policy. Whether it's Greens, ALP, United Australia Party, you name it. one nation, they subscribe to a particular ideology. So when you vote a representative into Parliament, unless you vote for an independent who gets into Parliament, which is very rare, but it does occur, the fact is that that representative's major responsibility is to toe the party line. Although in the Liberal Party you can actually vote against, exercise a conscience vote, in the Australian Labor Party, if you vote against the government of the day, you're expelled from the party, as we saw with the senator from West Australia. So, theoretically, although representatives represent the majority that elected them to take up their parliamentary seat, the fact is that most parliamentarians have subscribed to a particular ideology, a particular set of policies, and their responsibility and whether they go up, they become a minister or whatever, is dependent on how they behave within that party structure, because expulsion from a particular political party can be political death. Now, that's just the House of Representatives. Now, the Senate is a different kettle of fish. I don't know why we use the word kettle of fish, but it's a different kettle of fish. Now, when this country was formed, it was a federation. What happened is, in the 1880s, there were a number of national meetings where a constitution was hammered out. That constitution was put to the electors in each state, and eventually the states decided to federate, although in West Australia they never actually agreed to federate, they were incorporated into the federation. Now, in order to ensure that state rights became a feature of the political process, of the constitutional process, a Senate system was created. Now, the Senate system was created to ensure that the states with the larger populations didn't dominate the states with the lower population. Now, as far as the House of Representatives is concerned, it's about numbers. For example, I think in Tasmania you've got 5 House of Representative members, in the Northern Territory you've got 2. And in New South Wales, I think you've got 30 or 40. But as far as the Senate is concerned, every state has an equal number of senators, which is 12. Now, although the House of Representatives, we vote for the House of Representatives every 3 years, when we have a House of Representatives election, only half the senators come up for re-election. So senators have a 6-year role. They're elected for 6 years. House of Representatives are elected for 3 years. And the whole purpose of the Senate was to ensure that state rights were a fundamental feature of a future Australian society. And we saw that during the COVID-19 crisis, when states shut their borders, and we saw the extraordinary powers that in the federation that states were able to exercise. So when you go to vote, and voting is compulsory in this country, and I'll explain why in a minute, when you go to vote, you vote for the House of Representatives and you vote for the Senate. Now, we have in this country a proportional representation. We don't have first past the post voting as far as the federal election is concerned. What first past the post voting, which they have in the United Kingdom, means that the person or the party of the majority of the votes, even if it's 30% of the votes, wins the seat. In Australia, we have proportional representation. What that means is, in the House of Representatives, that votes are reallocated in terms of a preference that you place on your ballot paper. Say if there are 10 candidates in a House of Representatives seat, the candidate with the least numbers their votes go, you just count them out. So eventually, the two major parties will, fight it out for the seat, and the elect and the rep and the candidate who gets over 50% wins the seat. That's what's called federal election proportional representation. In the Senate, there are two mechanisms of voting. You can vote above the line, or you can vote below the line. If you vote below the line, you vote for every, candidate. Above the line, you can mark 6 boxes, 1 to 6. So, why is there compulsory voting in Australia? It's interesting. Although Australia was one of the first parliamentary democracy, compulsory voting was introduced in 1922 because few electors took up the opportunity to vote. And for example, in the 1903 election, I think only about 50% of eligible voters cast a ballot. Because obviously, a lot of people had trouble enrolling, but a lot of people felt that the whole process wasn't worth supporting. Right? So in 1922, compulsory voting was introduced to ensure that the candidate who was elected had a majority of the votes, more than 50% of the votes, right, that were cast. It gets a bit convoluted. So, and what's happened recently is because of the decrease in the number of people that are registered, the Australian Electoral Commission now has the power to automatically register you. If you get a pension or if you, get a licence or some type of government thing, you find yourself on the electoral roll. You may not even know you're on the electoral roll. Okay? So, the dilemma with parliamentary democracy is there's two dilemmas. One, the first dilemma is, as I said, the people that are elected from a party, major responsibilities to the party, not to the electorate. Now, in this country, we have a very unusual constitution because there is no mechanism by which to recall a parliamentarian in between elections. They can change their political parties, they can change their policies, they can go back on every promise they made, and there's nothing you can do until the next election to vote them out. If you're a senator, it can take up to 6 years to vote them out. So that's the dilemma that we face, right? That the representatives are more frightened of their party than they are of the people who've elected them into power. So once a ballot is cast, it becomes difficult for policies to be introduced which were not part of that party's philosophy or ideology. Now, you need an outright majority in the House of Representatives, and if you haven't got an outright majority, you need to cobble up a coalition to have an outright majority. And the political party with the most seats normally is the party that elects the Prime Minister. We don't have a presidential system, as they do in the United States of America, where Bufalini, carries on as if he's some type of dictator. The Prime Minister is at the mercy of the political party that is in power, that is in government. And if the Prime Minister becomes electorally unpopular, it's not unusual for that political party to cut off their heads, metaphorically, and elect a new Prime Minister who they think could be much more electorally, salvageable. So you've got this situation where the Prime Minister is a product of the Parliament. The Prime Minister is not a product of the people, as we see in a presidential election. And the Prime Minister has two fundamental rights. One, to appoint the Governor-General, who represents the Queen. Oh, sorry, she's dead now. My apologies, Lizzie. Who represents the King, Charlie III, in this country. And they have a very important role, because if you're elected as a parliamentarian and you refuse to give allegiance to the King and his heirs, then you cannot take up your seat in the Australian Parliament. it is a prerequisite that you give allegiance to the King of England, or Britain, Great Britain, or Little Britain, whatever you like to call it, and his heirs, not his hairs, H-A-I-R-S, but his heirs, in order to take up your parliamentary seat. But that's a side issue. So, why bother? Why bother to vote? Why bother to be involved in the parliamentary circus? Because you and I know that little change occurs in Australian society through parliamentary legislation. Some change occurs, but no major changes, because of all these extra pressures which are placed on parliamentarians by that small section of society that owns them, is reduction, distribution, exchange and communication, who ultimately decide what laws are passed through Parliament. Now, when you've got a country as rich as Australia and 1.5 million children living in poverty and private charities raising money to send Australian kids to Australian public schools, you know there's an issue. And that issue could be resolved tomorrow through Parliament. But because of the strength of the private education sector, political strength, not intellectual strength, we find that legislation to improve the public education sector tends to get bogged down in Parliament, is never passed. And if it is, it's not implemented. So we've got this situation where parliamentary policy, to a significant degree, is determined by forces outside of Parliament. So, you've got a number of options. Well, legal options. We'll only talk about legal options. Now, if you decide that no candidate is worth voting for, you can go to the booth, either in pre-polling or polling day, pick up your ballot paper and have your names crossed off the roll, and that's it. You don't actually have to vote. It's quite legal to go to the polling booth and have your name signed off. But what's the point of going to the polling booth and having your name signed off? Because ultimately, there are differences in political ideologies. There are differences. There's a political party that will use any means to justify the end, and the end is their election as the government of the day. And when you look at the range of ideas and the debate that occurs in society regarding particular policies and particular laws that need to be passed in Parliament to resolve many of our issues, you find there are significant differences. And different parties can make an impact. Not a revolutionary impact, no real impact on the private investment for private profit ideology, not much of an impact on ensuring that the Commonwealth is used for the common good, but you can make an impact. So you've got a balance in your mind. Do you want that individual within your electorate? Do you want that political party to be in power to make decisions for you? You know, that's the decision you need to make. Now, very few people just have when they're there, they may as well decide they're going to vote, all right? Now, when you vote, you've got a number of options. You can actually put what you do in the polling booth, well, it's not a booth anymore, it's a little paper thing, is your business, But unless you mark all the boxes in order of preference in the House of Representatives, your vote is invalid, all right? So there are things you need to do to cast a valid vote. Now, a very small section of society casts informal votes that are not valid. Most informal votes are cast because people have difficulty in filling out the ballot paper for a variety of reasons. But there is a small section that votes informal because of their opposition to the parliamentary system. So, why bother? All right? That's the dilemma I face every election time. It's a dilemma I face, and everybody faces. Why bother? Now, some people say that by participating in the electoral process, you are confirming the system. But the dilemma is, although you're confirming the system, the dilemma you face is if you don't actually vote, you may find elements in society who are elected into Parliament who will make rules and regulations and laws which cut across any rights you may have or you wish to exercise. And that's the dilemma. Because it doesn't matter if 95% of the people, eligible voters, vote or 30% of the eligible voters vote and the rest of the voters boycott it. The fact is that 30% will then determine the majority who will be sent to Parliament on your behalf. So that's a catch-22 situation, basically. If you vote, you are supporting the system. If you don't vote, you're really not doing much at all, all right? Not much at all. A lot of people say if 70% of the people don't vote, the government that is voted in is illegitimate. It may be illegitimate morally and ethically, but it's still a government, and that's what happens. And that's what happened in 1920, before 1922, before compulsory voting was introduced into this country. So, I've decided to put my feet in the water. Not because I'm going to be elected. Be lucky if I get 1% of the vote. Let's be realistic. You've got to be realistic in this situation. Not because, my candidature is going to create any lasting change, right? And not because I support the system. But I do recognise that in the parliamentary elections there are opportunities which exist which don't exist in an apolitical society, because in Australia it's basically an apolitical society. Most of us are not that interested in what happens in the parliamentary process, but we're quite happy to complain about it. It's the old story, the Gunner tribe, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, or more importantly, that somebody should do something about that tribe. We never think that it's us that determines the future of this country. So, all right, I've decided, maybe you've decided that you want to stand as the parliamentary candidate. Now, it's an expensive business, all right? Because it is a business and it's expensive and it's convoluted. If you want to run in the Senate and you want a box above the line, you need 2 candidates and $4,000, I think, is the entry fee. And if you don't get 4% of the vote, you don't get your $4,000 back. It's that simple. That's if you want. And the trouble is, if you're an independent candidate, you'll love this. This is what I love about the Australian electoral system. It's really weighted towards the major political parties. If you're an independent candidate and you've got 2 or 3 people running on your ticket and you've got a box above the line, guess what? You cannot put the word independent next to the box. It's a legal no-no. So you may run in a Senate election and there's 25 candidates and 23 political parties with a name next to the box, and there's this empty box. There's this box without a name. All right? Tragedy. Now, if there's only one of you and you want to run for the Senate, I think it's $2,000, you get a box below the line. And that is political death, because only 3% of electors usually bother to vote below the line. That's in the Senate. But in the House of Representatives, it's a different matter. Now, the first thing you need is $2,000. Now, you may not have $2,000. Maybe some friends will give you $2,000. But you need $2,000. That is the fee to stand in a federal election in the House of Representatives. Now, if you're a registered political party, which obviously I'm not talking about, you just do bulk nominations. You turn up and, somebody turns up from the party and says, I've got 100 people here are going to stand. Here's the money, 100 people, that's 2,000, here's 20 grand. Thank you very much. Bingo. Now, the Australian Electoral Commission doesn't take checks. So if you are going to go, the first thing you need to find out is where the Australian Electoral Commission is in that electorate. And as these electorates are quite large, because they've got over about 100,000 voters each electorate, maybe up to 110, 120, you're going to find the electoral office. Now, how does it work? The Prime Minister calls an election. The writs are read, which makes the election hunky-dory, real, right? Then I think there's 10 days to or maybe a few days to sort out the electoral roll, gives you a chance to enrol or re-enrol. And then you've got a 10-day period where you need to find people in that electorate who are willing to nominate you, because you just can't stand. You need 100 people. If you want to stand as an independent in a House of Representatives seat, you need 100 people in that electorate to nominate you, right? 100. Minimum of 100 people. If you don't have 100 people, although you're flashing your $2,000, your $100 notes, the fact is that you cannot stand as a candidate. Now, if by some, and then you've got to fill out this extraordinary convoluted form regarding your background, because Section 44 of the Australian Constitution makes it very difficult for people whose parents were born overseas, or anybody holding dual citizenship, to actually stand as a candidate. It's quite extraordinary the way the electoral system is designed under Section 44 of the Australian Constitution, and the way it's been interpreted by the High Court, which did what we call a black letter interpretation. They interpreted it as if every word was gospel. Unlike the free speech High Court challenge, which found that free speech existed during the electoral process, and only during the electoral process, because you didn't have free speech during an electoral process, you couldn't have an election. Okay. So, you've passed the 2 hurdles, all right? You're a House of Representative candidate. Now, I've chosen to try, and the key word is try. I haven't got anywhere yet, but to try, to nominate for the seat of Flinders in Victoria. Very nice seat. I'd love to live in Flinders if I had the money, but unfortunately I don't. But because I don't live in the electorate doesn't mean I can't stand, okay? It's not like a local election. So, I'm going to try to nominate as a candidate for Flinders. Why? Why bother? And that was the original question. Why waste money, time, resources? Why bother? What's the point when the gun is loaded against you? What's the point? You've got organisations, political parties with millions of dollars, with campaign donations from who knows whom, to ensure you can do enough, propaganda to assist your candidature in the electorate. Letterboxing, signs, advertisements. The list goes on and on. So some people say unless you've got $1 million in your back pocket, and most of us don't have a spare $1 million, there's no point standing. Well, there are 2 types of people standing. Those who just shut their mouths for the sake of having their name on the ballot paper, and those who put forward ideas. Now, I find federal elections especially are times when you can put fresh ideas to the electorate. Whether the electorate takes it up or not is a different matter. In the majority of cases, they don't take it up. But whether they take it up is a different matter, and whether you've got the resources and the people involved in the campaign to get your message across during a very short period, usually about 3 weeks, is becoming increasingly difficult for people. So why am I trying, the key word is to try to become a candidate in the electorate of Flinders. Well, the electorate of Flinders is a blue ribbon Liberal seat. Never been held by anybody else. The current member was elected 3 years ago. The member before that was a well-known member of the Liberal Party, I think Greg Hunt. I think over 20 years he held the seat. And I think Zoe McKenzie is the current... I know Zoe McKenzie is the current Liberal member. Now, the Liberal Party is normally elected quite easily in the electorate of Flinders for a variety of ideas. So it's a perfect electorate to challenge the status quo, because you'll find the Labor Party won't be spending much time or money pushing their candidate in that particular electorate because they're not going to win. They know they're not going to win. Now, obviously there'll be progressive candidates, progressive independents, there'll be Green candidates, and all the political parties, as many as possible, will field a candidate, because they don't even need to find 100 electors in that particular electorate to nominate them. Just bulk nomination. Bang, here's your money, thank you ma'am, wham, bang, thank you ma'am. That's the way it goes as far as those electoral politics are concerned. So, what are the policies that I'm interested in pursuing? What policies am I interested in pursuing in this federal election? Because, you see, the way federal elections are run in 2025 is that it's basically a head-to-head battle between the two leaders of the major parties. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation is hamstrung by legislation, which means that it needs to give most of the time it devotes to political debate to the major parties, and new kids on the block don't get any time whatsoever as far as the legislation is concerned, So, why bother? Well, I think it's important in a period in Australian life, that's an election period, when people are forced to think about the political process and how decisions are made, that it's important to not give up that opportunity to put new ideas into the electorate. Now, obviously, a letterboxing campaign can be quite successful, though most people don't check their letterboxes today, and you need a little bit of a publicity regarding your ideas. Now, I've chosen a blue ribbon Liberal seat to stand in because I think it's important that we highlight, especially in a seat where the Liberal candidate's supposed to be a shoo-in, that we actually highlight policies that nobody talks about that could have a fundamental positive impact on the Australian people. Because in a period of increasing economic inequality and increasing entrenched privilege because of that economic inequality, we have more social dislocation, community and social dislocation in the community. And what I mean by social dislocation, I'm not talking about riots and arson and all that type of stuff and revolution. I'm talking about this type of social dislocation where individuals bear the brunt of that alienation, where people are so alienated by the political, cultural, social process that they find themselves in, that they turn in on themselves. They think somehow it's their fault. And we see increases in substance abuse and addiction. We see increases in anxiety, psychiatric issues. We see increases in divisions and hatred where the major political parties are creating artificial divisions between Australians which are based on race or gender or sexual orientation or the language you speak or where you come from. We see this hatred and divisions increase in society. So having a candidate who raises the issue of economic inequality, not issue-orientated politics, but economic inequality has the major issue confronting Australians as the way to go forward to resolve the issues that we, an increasing number of people in this country, are facing in terms of looking after their basic necessities. That's the issue. So, what are the policies I'll be promoting? And maybe, I've got these. This is nothing new, but maybe you would like to go through this rigmarole. You got the $2,000. You want to stand for Parliament. You've got your 100 nominations. So, what are your policies? Now, I'll be standing if I get the 100 nominations, and that's something I'll find out in the next few weeks, whether there's any interest in the campaign, because there may be no interest. It is a blue ribbons Liberal seat. Hopefully there is, but then, you've got to be realistic about these situations. So what are the policies I'm interested in pursuing and promoting as an alternative to the policies which the major political parties and the great majority of independents, even if they're called progressive independents, will be pursuing? Because very few will be going against the status quo. They'll be going against the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. We'll be putting forward policies which challenge increasing inequality and the entrenched privilege that this increased inequality brings to society. Well, one thing I'm interested in with the age of artificial intelligence is a universal basic income. And I've said this before. In the good old days, not there were ever any good old days, in the days of the Roman Empire over 2,000 years ago, we had patricians, the ruling classes, and plebeians, the rest of us. Now, both had a role in the Republic, right? A role before it became an empire. They had a role, an important role. But as the Roman Empire expanded, the Republic expanded, what we saw is that the plebeians were pushed out of work through the patrician class acquiring slaves from the countries they'd conquered. So instead of paying the plebeians, they had slaves who they just fed and clothed and housed. And what we saw is increasing dislocation, social dislocation and rebellion within the Roman plebeians. So in order to resolve this issue, because they didn't need them, they needed them politically, but didn't need them economically, they introduced their own, the first universal basic income. Subsidies on food, subsidies on housing, 245 holidays. This is the old bread and circuses concept, which we talk about, bread and circuses. It's about ensuring that although people had political power, they had no economic power. So if you provide them with some stability, then you decrease social dislocation. Now, artificial intelligence, the digital age, is important. And irrespective of what you or I think, it's going to have major, major implications for many, many, many people around the globe. Major implications. And these major implications are based on the idea that we don't need everybody in society to be involved in the productive process in order for society to survive and prosper. Artificial intelligence means not everyone living in the community needs to be involved in the wage system. And as the way we identify ourselves in this country and in all Western countries, and a private investor for private profit world, is our incorporation into the wage system is what gives us some type of economic stability. Because 6 weeks loss of pay means poverty, all right? It's that simple. Because majority of people live on a week-to-week basis. So the introduction of a universal basic income will decrease economic inequality and improve social cohesion. It is a critical part of thinking for the 21st century in terms of this country, the people of this country being able to enjoy the Commonwealth. So how are we going to fund a universal basic income? Well, there are a number of ways. There are people who believe in modern monetary theory, who think the government can create that money. I'm not a fan of that particular thing, but I am a fan of actually ensuring that the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who are part of the investment class pull their weight. So ways of reducing economic inequality, decreasing entrenched privilege, and improving social cohesion. There are a number of ways, and you don't require blood in the streets. These are policies which could be implemented tomorrow through a parliamentary process. These are reformist policies. These are not radical policies. Well, they're radical, but they're not revolutionary, all right? You're not asking for change, root and branch change of society, and the destruction of the private investment for private profit model. This is a model which can be incorporated in the private investment for private profit, but ensures that the Commonwealth is used for the common good, not for a decreasing number of people in this country. So, what are these policies that we'll be using? And obviously, you're more than welcome to use them. These are not my policies. These are bread and butter issues. Anybody with half a brain or one synapse neuron would be able to understand the importance of these policies. The first thing I'm interested in is the 1% financial transaction tax. Don't forget that when we introduced the goods and services tax, food was excluded, but also financial transactions were excluded. By placing a 1% tax on all financial transactions over $5,000, and it's very easy to actually keep an eye on them in the digital age, you could raise over $100 billion every year in this country, up to $140 billion every year, which would go a long way into financing a universal basic income. Although everybody receives a universal basic income, the fact is that people who, have got a lot of money, people who are still in the paid, want to be in the paid workforce, most of that universal basic income would come back through the taxation system. But on top of that, a 1% financial transaction tax would actually increase the amount of resources required to finance a universal basic income. Another tax I'm interested in pursuing is something that is so brutally simple and so easy to collect in a digital age. A 1% stock market. That's right, a 1% stock market tax. Every time you buy a share, bought or sold a share of a stock or got involved in the stock market, 1% will automatically go to the Treasury. It's just a matter of altering the computer. 1% straight into the Treasury. Today, people get a tax deduction, for owning stocks and shares. Why not? A simple 1% transaction tax would mean up to $40 billion could be raised every year. And I'm not just talking a financial transaction tax in this country, but every Australian corporation, every individual has an Australian passport, anywhere in the world investing 1% back to the Federal Treasury. I mean, this is something to think about, Why should wage earners bear the burden of taxation in this country? They pay over 65% of every dollar of taxation. 1/3 of corporations, many of them profitable, paid no tax in the last 12 months. Legally, no tax. So I'm interested in that. Now, the big one, if you think those aren't big, the big one is this country's natural resources, this country's mineral resources. Now, there have been a few individuals and a few corporations who've been making hay with this country's natural resources over the last, since Federation or before Federation. Now, it's incredible that many of these companies receive money from the Australian Treasury, although they're making billions of dollars. And many of these companies, although they're making billions of dollars, the way the taxation system is constructed, don't pay tax for years on any projects they initiate. So what I'm proposing is nationalising without compensation any mineral resource extraction company that has a turnover of more than $100 million. The other option is to charge them 90% tax. Not on profits, but on turnover. There are options. Why should this country's mineral wealth, which theoretically belongs to the Commonwealth, which is all of us, why should the majority of that wealth, apart from the 2% of people who work in the mining sector, flow into the hands of private investors? Why can't the country, you and me, why can't we take back these resources? Use them to deal with the First Nations issues. Use them to deal with increasing poverty in this country. Use them to break the nexus between growing inequality and, a privileged existence. Use it. These are our resources. These belong to the country, and government after government after government, irrespective of their political colours, has given away these resources. Look at the Norwegians. You wouldn't call them a radical society. North Sea Oil, trillions of dollars in their future fund. A significant amount of taxation, anything extracted, goes into their future fund. Look at us. Peppercorn royalties. Most of these large corporations don't pay tax, and if they pay tax, it's nothing in comparison to the profits they're making from extracting resources. Compulsory acquisition. Obviously, there may be constitutional questions, but they can be resolved at a later date. There's nothing wrong with raising these ideas. We need to raise these ideas because we need to find different ways of approaching the growing inequality and the entrenched privilege, which is such part and parcel of life in Australia today. And then we need to think about First Nations people. Look at the lack of progress, the going backwards. We're running backwards as far as acknowledging not only that they were the first people, but actually acknowledging that we owe compensation, that we need to embark on a treaty process in this country to heal these festering wounds that cause so much dislocation and so many issues in our society. And something else you and I are interested in, because we should be, if you look at the number of natural disasters in this country, is the impending climate emergency. Some people say it's here, but I say it's impending. The impending climate emergency. And the pushback, the extraordinary pushback against renewable energy. That should we fast track the way forward with renewable energy. Forget about the furphy about nuclear energy. We're talking about today. When you look at the unseasonal temperatures around the country, when you talk to farmers and they tell you how farming practices have changed, when you as a backyard gardener can start growing bananas in Melbourne, you begin to understand there are changes afoot, and these are major changes, and these changes are going to escalate. When we talk about temperatures in their mid-40s and high 40s in Central Australia, when we talk about record rainfalls in Northern Australia, when we talk about bushfire seasons that are starting, before summer, you begin to understand there are issues. And the tragedy is that many of the people who think this is a hoax, that climate emergency don't exist, are the very people who, because they live in regional and rural Australia, are the very people who are suffering today. So, obviously, this should be at the forefront of any policies. So, look, this is just some things I'm interested in. But it's about overcoming increasing economic inequality, which entrenches economic privilege, which causes increasing social dislocation, whether it's community-based or whether it's, internalised, and you see a personal cost for it. Every day I think to myself when I wake up, this is potentially a wonderful country. Potentially. But we need to address a number of important issues, and if we're not willing to raise this issue during an election because we're too frightened of what the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication think, what's the point? So I am encouraging you, with the federal election round the corner, to think about standing as a candidate. Put forward radical policies. We have progressive independents, but their policies are pretty watered down. Everybody is concerned about the situation we find ourselves in, but we don't feel that we have the capacity for change. Now, whether you think parliamentary democracy is a farce or not, whether you think it's 2 minutes of illusory power, this is a period that we can take advantage of. It is one of the few times in a depoliticised society where we're fighting each other over minuscule differences that we can raise big questions in the electorate. We don't have to limit ourselves to the ideas and the policies which are brought forward by the major political parties and the minor political parties. Now, many political parties are issue-orientated. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what the issue is. Ultimately, capitalism can incorporate any issue within its framework that does not challenge the private investment for private profit mentality, which is the central feature of a capitalist society. It can incorporate, issues regarding gender, issues regarding sexual preferences and orientation, issues regarding race, issues regarding discrimination, and the list goes on and on. As long as those issues, the solutions to those issues, do not impinge on profitability, they can be incorporated in society. But when we have people like you and me who challenge the very essence of capitalism, who talk about creating a third tier of the Australian economy based on collectives and cooperatives to offer some real competition to the private sector and the dramatically reduced public sector, that's when we can have an impact. Because ultimately, economic inequality entrenches privilege, increases social dislocation. So the struggle that we're involved in on the parliamentary process is part of that. Well, thank you for listening. Listen in next week. I'll be back in the studio and we'll see how we're going. Listen in to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station next week. I won't see you, but you will hear me. And if you do ring, I'll hear you. Thank you once again for listening to The Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to The Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
You might have heard about the Community Radio Plus app, but it's only when you start using it that you'll wonder how you lived without it.
You can listen to us wherever you are, at home, work, driving.
On public transport, gardening, protesting, or even in the bath.
Just search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.